Hi, so nice to be here. Thank you for having me, Jeff and the library. My name's Imran. I use they, them pronouns. I live in Philadelphia. Um, like Jeff said, I work for an organization called BlackStar. We host the annual BlackStar Film Festival. And we also do a number of other programs all centered around uplifting and creating space for Black, Brown, and Indigenous visual artists, filmmakers. Um, and, but I'm really excited to be here because I used to live in San Jose. I used to live with Jeff actually, and um, other folks too. But I did an AmeriCorps program there. And so it's cool. I've been to San Jose libraries. And so it's cool to be able to do this with you all. And of course, during this month, I know that there is so much going on in the country, so much we could start with and talk about. But when I think about the Asian American community right now and the um, broader, the acronyms are very long, but the broader communities that we are talking about today, first thing that comes to mind is kind of the violence that's been directed at our communities, particularly certain East Asian communities, working class communities of women, and those working in, places where a lot of attention and support is not often given. And so, that's on my mind today when we talk about love in Hollywood, because, for the last, I guess I'm getting older and it's been like 10 years, but the last 10 years or so, I've been thinking a lot about what happens or what the point is or the impact of representations of love in Hollywood, particularly for those who are not represented. Um, and so I hope to come back to the ways in which I do think that the topic we're talking about today is very directly connected to the violence um, affecting our various communities at the moment, and of course historically, as well as Black and Indigenous communities in America as well. So before we start, I actually want to start with a question just for the audience, because I think it's fun to know this about everyone, and it's a way for us to begin chatting. But I want to ask what your earliest memory is of seeing love, or however you want to interpret that, seeing love represented in a movie. So, it could be as early as you can remember, or just one that stands out from your childhood. What's a movie, or, we could also broaden it and talk about TV, but what's something that you remember, first time you remember seeing love represented on screen? And I'll put the question in the chat as well. Give folks a minute to think about it, but yeah, Disney films, definitely. Disney Princess. Wonder Years, that's a good one. Yeah, so Princess Love and Novella Love. And as we start to list those, I think it's worth thinking about, or start to think about, like, maybe, I don't know, what if anything you think you learned from those representations. Little Mermaid, The Simpsons, nice. So I'm going to share one of the ones that comes to mind for me always when I think it's not necessarily the first film, but it tracks with what a lot of folks have shared here. But we're going to play a quick clip from the one that I'll start with, and I think Jeff has that clip.
Yes.
I can show you the world, shining, shimmering, splendid. Tell me, princess, now when did you last let your heart decide? I can open your eyes, take you wonder by wonder, over, sideways, and under, on a magic carpet ride, a whole new world. Fantastic point of view. No one to tell us no, or where to go, or say we're only dreaming.
A whole new world, a dazzling place I never knew. But when I'm way up here, it's crystal clear that now
Yeah, just I don't. We could have listened to the whole song. It's actually a great song. But you know, for me, Aladdin came out when I was probably like 8 or 9, and so it wasn't the first film I saw that has love in it, of course, but it's the one that stands out to me the most because I grew up in Springfield, Illinois, and there weren't a lot of Bangladeshi kids in my city. I was raised Muslim, um, and so you know the fact that these characters, which they're kind of coded as Muslim, it's not explicit, but and of course have brownish skin. You know, that was one of the first times that I saw in a film that everybody at school was talking about and was, you know, a very popular film. I saw myself represented there. And within that, I saw the potential that, you know, I could be a hero too. And, you know, even in the characters which aren't Aladdin, they're, you know, sometimes at school I would get teased and get called Jafar and stuff after that. But you know, I've talked about this before, but even then I was like, hey, I mean, at least you maybe know my name now. But you know, in addition to the you know, potentially you could say maybe positive things I got from that, you know, over the years, over time, as I look back on it, there was a lot of other stuff going on in Aladdin, a lot of other messages that were being sent to me and to the people around me. Um, you know, I could also talk about Aladdin for like just Aladdin for 2 hours. I've done a lot of thinking about it, but you know that film was made by white people. It's a representation of a made-up place where actually, you know, my family is not from, and actually nobody is from because it's not a real place. Aladdin takes place in a city called Agrabah, which when it was written, it's a combination of Agra, which is a city in India, where the Taj Mahal is, and Baghdad, which is in Iraq, and is very far from India. And one of the things that Aladdin does is it collapses a whole part of Asia, a whole part of Middle East and North Africa, and creates this vision of what that place is. And though it's set in the past, um, it perpetuates an idea that, you know, our parts of the world are forever in the past. And so, you know, there were so many of these messages which are coming across in Aladdin, which I wasn't necessarily aware of. And we could talk about, like I said, there's lots of other things. The actors um, are white who do the voices for the most part. There's queer antagonism. You know, Jafar, who's the villain, is coded as being queer, and there's a whole other story to tell there. But within all of this, you know, within all these messages that are embedded within Aladdin, is an idealization of a romantic relationship. And so one of the biggest things that I took away from the film is, you know, a story about what love looks like, you know. And of course it mirrors and tracks with a lot of the examples that others gave in the chat. You know, love in Disney films is, if we just look at that, it's almost always between straight people. It's almost always between white characters, though in recent years that's shifted. And you know, before recently, like I mentioned in Aladdin, even when you saw characters of color, they were often voiced by white people, as it is in The Simpsons historically too. And so, you know, the story about love that was registering was coming from a very particular perspective that didn't necessarily have my best interests in mind. But I think before we even go in deeper into that, I think one of the questions that I always am faced with, or people ask, is like, you know, yeah, but do movies really matter that much? You know, I started talking about real world violence that, you know, people are facing today in America at the hands of the police, and also, you know, at the hands of like mass shooters. And you might say, like, what does media and cinema have to do with that? And folks are very skeptical that film can have any kind of impact on behavior and culture in a meaningful way. And there's two examples that real quickly I like to use to just emphasize that movies do matter, and like all stories, they have impacts on the way we think. You know, one example is Finding Nemo. Let's just stay with like the Disney theme. You know, Finding Nemo, as many folks might know, is a Pixar Disney film about really about two clownfish, one a father and son, and the son gets lost and the dad has to find him. But anyways, it was a very popular film, and as a result of Finding Nemo, that type of fish, which is represented in the film, clownfish, actually became further endangered because so many people suddenly wanted clownfish in their homes. You know, they bought them as pets. They, you know, thought that they were so pretty now. And so an immediate effect of Finding Nemo's popularity was, you know, this population of fish was suddenly endangered. Another impact, if you also come staying in the water and with fish, is Jaws. You know, prior to 1975, when Jaws came out, the fear of sharks was not reported amongst folks in the United States as a top fear. And in fact, you know, I was just reading a study today that said that like people didn't even really think of sharks as necessarily scary animals, and certainly not to the degree that we do now. But right after Jaws came out, the fear of sharks jumped to like a top 10 fear in the United States. Research around sharks increased, funding for that research increased, and you saw a cultural shift around how we think about sharks, another animal that's always been there, just like clownfish. And I just bring up these examples kind of randomly because to me they show that, you know, you can't really deny that cinema, and particularly Hollywood cinema, which has the widest reach of any cinema in the world, has an impact on culture and can even impact behavior, you know, and how we, if it can impact how we treat animals, you know, I'm fairly certain it impacts how we treat each other. So if we accept that film can have an impact on society and on human behavior, then I think it's really important to go back to this question of what are we learning about cinema, about people and how we treat each other. You know, the film critic Roger Ebert, the late film critic, he called cinema an empathy machine. And, you know, that's contested. I think we could have a discussion about that. But if we accept that in many ways, one of the purposes of movies are to put ourselves in the shoes of other folks, of other characters, you know, to take a journey into the lives of the people represented on screen, then people like Roger Ebert have argued that that's creating empathy. And so if that's the case, then we've really got to ask, like, who is this machine built for, and who is it creating empathy for? Because it is true, I believe, that pretty much every Hollywood film is about human relationships, including the ones that are cartoons and about fish, you know. And if you go deeper into that, I think you can argue that most films are about love on some level. You know, perhaps not romantic love always, but if you think about familial love and all other kinds of love between humans, almost every movie is about finding, pursuing, saving, restoring, remembering love. The very first film, actually, well, what some people would call the first Hollywood film, by D.W. Griffith, who, you know, was racist and made many racist films. But that film, In Old California, in 1910, it was a romance. So Hollywood film kind of comes out of romantic film and has always been kind of centered around romance. And, you know, even if you're thinking about like the top movies today, which may not be marketed as romantic films or films about love, like Marvel films, those are all still about human relationships, and almost all of them have romantic storylines or storylines within them about love between characters, whether it's lost or regained. But, you know, I think in particular, I want to look at, just for reference, a list of the top, oops, I'm having, can you all see my screen? Yeah, okay. I just, you know, I was looking at the top romantic comedies of all time, according to this database by IMDb. And, you know, so if we go back to this question of like, okay, if cinema is creating some sort of empathy or has the potential to do that, if then we also say, you know, we gather messages from cinema which has an impact on our lives and our behaviors, then, you know, it's worth looking at the films that are specifically marketed as like films about love, to just start to think about like, what are we getting from these movies about what love looks like. So I'm just looking at like the top 25, and if you look at the top 25, you know, from my count, there's only about 4 films here which have primary characters who are characters of color. Almost all these films are films that star white people, and even more particularly, even the films which have, you know, like Hitch, starring Will Smith, which have characters of color in them, they're almost always written and directed by white people. One of the rare exceptions on this list is actually Crazy Rich Asians, which just came out a few years ago. And I used to give this talk like 3 or 4 years ago, and at the time there was like none on this list. And so, and the reason I think that that's interesting is that, you know, this is a quick screenshot, or what's it called, like quick view into how Hollywood is showing us what love looks like. Another thing I like to do is just search on Google. What does a romantic film look like? You know, so romantic films look like straight white people kissing, I guess, for the most part. You know, you can do you know, this is what love in a movie theater looks like, you know. And again, you know, this isn't scientific, but the reason I like to show that is that, you know, Hollywood movies are seen by millions and millions of people, not only in the United States, but around the world. And, you know, overall, this is the impression that it's leaving on us about what love is supposed to look like. So again, the question is, what happens when overall, you know, romance is and love is tied to cis, straight, white, wealthy American people, and it's mostly told from the perspective of within that men. So I think about not how that impacts necessarily the white audience members as much as I want to think about how it impacts people of color, and particularly those who are least likely to be seen or have a voice in the writing and creating of these stories. So I'm thinking about queer Black women, thinking about, as I started to say at the top, East Asian women, those who are working class, sex workers, folks who are not seeing their stories represented, but also just not seeing their faces and their people like them falling in love, treating each other with love or being treated with love. And I think about how does that impact how we grow up thinking about who is worthy of love, who is capable of it, and who is worthy of receiving it. And I think that that's what's most dangerous about and there's a term for this in some media studies that's called symbolic annihilation, which is that when you don't represent anyone, a certain group of people, you create the impression that that group doesn't exist, or if you represent folks with just a single type of representation. So like in a lot of these romantic films that we just saw on that list, you do have characters of color. Often it might be a Black woman who's a friend who has a certain, role in the film, which is to give advice and then to not do anything else. Or it might be, an East Asian man who's like the best man in like some, in a wedding scene, and then never appears again. And so there's also that concept of the ways in which a single story about any community erases all the variety and possibilities that truly exist within our communities. And it tells that story to us as well as kids about, who we are, what we're capable of, and what we deserve. So, I at the top was talking about the connections that then brings to mind about the treatment of communities of color in the United States, because Hollywood is not a system which is just like, independent or um, detached from the rest of society, right? Because the um, the Hollywood is a tool of a larger system and has those in power in Hollywood have a vested interest in maintaining the status quo. And that system, more broadly, is about maintaining power for wealthy white cis straight men, or a system which Bell Hooks has called imperialist, white supremacist, capitalist patriarchy. And so there is a reason why we might not, or those in power might not want all of us to experience love. There's a reason why those in power may not want all of us to know that we are very capable of loving each other and loving ourselves and being loved. So the machine of Hollywood, if it is an empathy machine, it works as long as it's in the hands of certain folks, and being financed and supported by a larger capitalist system which keeps all of those people in power. It has an interest in keeping us away from experiencing empathy and love for ourselves in our communities. So all that to say, I do think that there are ways that cinema can challenge this, though. So, and I think that's the question of, what can we do? you know, there's a quote by, actually, before I go into that, I would love to play another clip. So this next clip is a film by Garrett Bradley called Time, which was nominated for an Oscar this year for Best Documentary. It didn't win, but it's largely an independent film. We actually showed it at the BlackStar Film Festival last year, and it comes out of, you know, Garrett Bradley did a couple of other short films, documentary films, and they're all about mass incarceration, the impact it has on Black Americans, particularly Black women. And in this film, Time, this is also a love story. And so I'll talk about it more afterwards, but Jeff, you can play that clip.
Judge's office.
My name is Sybil Richardson, and my family is awaiting on a ruling regarding my husband's matter. I was just wondering if you might have any information on like an update on it.
No, we don't have anything. You have to just look to us on Monday.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you so much.
Okay, all
Have a
right.
good weekend. Bye-bye. This is Sybil Richardson again. Where you at?
No, we don't have anything.
All righty. Thank you so much. My twins will be 18 next month. They have absolutely no idea what it means to have a father in their house, what fathers even do.
Hello.
Did you get any word from over at the big house today?
Anything yet?
Nothing yet?
No,
Okay. You got a chance to call today?
I have not.
No? Okay. Man, these people have no respect for other human beings' lives. No matter how sane or how understanding you try to be, it just will make you lose your absolute mind. You know how hard I'm gonna be smiling when you come home? Success is the best revenge. Success is the best revenge. You're gonna show them that they can't treat human life this way. Success is the best revenge. Just hang in there, because when you get them home, they gonna pay, they gonna pay, they gonna pay. I knew that if it was gonna be, it was gonna be totally up to me.
Yeah, so to me, Time is an example of romantic film, cinema about love, which does something completely different. You know, it challenges the status quo, and it challenges our comfort in the way things are and the narratives we've been told about, again, who gets love, who's deserving of love, and what love can do. You know, because one of the things that you know, I do think that cinema has the possibility to do for us is to remind us of the way that love is about, can be used towards liberation for our communities, can be used to, and is used to motivate great change. And I think the way that someone like Garrett Bradley does that is not only in the content of the story, but the way in which you know, she approaches making that film. Because one of the things I think that we have to do, as you know, when we go on and watch movies after this chat, it's not only to look at who's represented on screen, but how the stories are told and for what purpose. Because I mentioned that Crazy Rich Asians is one of the only films, directed by an Asian person, which appears on that top list of romantic films. But you could argue also that, Crazy Rich Asians, which I do like, saw it in theaters, also still, plays into certain narratives around wealth and worth as it relates to, money. But so it's not always just representation, but how we tell the stories about love and who gets to tell those stories. And a couple thoughts I'll just leave you with, and then we can kind of talk more broadly as a group. But I think it's worth also remembering that the camera itself, the system by which we make movies comes out of the system we're talking about when we're saying that Hollywood is like, it started from this place with D.W. Griffith and that first romantic film. And as I mentioned, D.W. Griffith was very racist. He made the film Birth of a Nation, which was basically like a pro, Ku Klux Klan film in the 1920s. But the styles that those white men really developed in cinematography, in like how you direct, in how a film is really about the director rather than a team. These are ideas and concepts which are embedded in how we still make movies today. And so if we want to break apart like this concept of like who is deserving of empathy and love, we also have to break apart our ideas of like what a movie is and how it's supposed to be made. Early films were also rooted in colonialism and like documenting the experiences of white settlers, taking over lands and places from Black and Brown and Indigenous people all over the world. And those are some of our earliest films too. And so I just say that to say that like, some of the most exciting and beautiful and vibrant stories about love and that are happening right now are coming from directors of color and Indigenous directors who are willing to show us how our own communities tell stories, how we already are practiced in the art of telling romantic stories. We don't have to mirror the methods of like Aladdin, though we can if we want, but there are other ways to tell these stories. And, and I think that that's the future of romantic film is, queer and trans filmmakers of color, fat filmmakers of color, disabled folks, telling our own stories about how, we want to see ourselves represented, and telling our own stories about what love looks like in our communities and why, how much love we have for each other and for our people. And I think that's how romantic film can be a tool for liberation. So yeah, I feel like I rambled a lot, but that's kind of the general idea I wanted to discuss today. And I know we have like 20 more minutes, and I can keep talking forever, but wanted to see if there were any questions that came up from folks or things that I mentioned that you wanted to talk more about or hear more about. Yeah, or any other ideas or any other movies that came to mind that, you remember from way back when.
Well, I have a couple of thoughts. First, I want to say thank you for your ability to just engage us, because I get that storytelling vibe from you. So thank you for keeping us engaged. I know keeping me engaged. And when you were talking about the first movie, 1920 or something, and kind of how that was like the framework that was set, it made me think about in colleges and universities and film schools, how it's perpetuated there, because you see this first movie or this movie that did great and you think that's the blueprint. So it's like one thing that we have to do is change how we move that forward at the university and school level.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, it also makes you think about like, so yeah, like D.W. Griffith's filmmaking style you know, at that period also that was black and white. And then we, of course, eventually got to color. And one of the things that happened when film went to color is people of color were not involved in filming, you know, when we did show up on screen. And so things like lighting, makeup, you know, how our skin shows on camera wasn't, and to this day really isn't taught in a way that is really going to show the beauty of our communities, you know. And I think that that's another just like a technical factor, but it's to your point, it's like how we learn how to make movies and what a good movie looks like, that all these kind of things get embedded and then make it harder for us to tell stories which actually feel good, you know. Yeah, that was a great question. I think there's like a question in the comments, or a comment says, is interracial love Hollywood movie racist or equity? It's a good question. I mean, I think I kind of understand what you're saying there. Is like, is the goal interracial love, or is that still kind of presenting a barrier or something? I mean, I think it's less, you know, here's the thing also, I think that films about white people, even films about white people in love, are not inherently always an issue. If at the root of any of these stories, if they're trying to challenge the dominance of the system of oppression, you know. So if a film's about, you know, a South Asian person in love with a white person, or it's about, you know, one of my favorite movies, Monsoon Wedding, it's about South Asian, sorry, that's one of Mira Nair's film, but her other previous film, Mississippi Masala, it's about, you know, a black man, Denzel Washington, falls in love with a South Asian woman. So, you know, whatever form of love is being represented, that's interracial as well. So I don't think you could say that all, you know, it's racist or not. I think it's the content and the storytelling, and not necessarily who's on screen, you know, because if the story is directed at challenging, you know, as I mentioned, the status quo, then it can be a tool for liberation, and it can help, and it can show us that, again, that we're all capable of different, feeling different things and deserving of those things. Yeah, and Hattie McDaniel, the first Black woman to win an Oscar, but yeah, wasn't even invited initially to attend. That's a good point. Are there other questions or comments that anyone thought of or would like to chat about?
Why watching? Like, for example, a white guy playing an Asian guy, or the white guy playing a black guy. Thank you.
Oh, sorry, can you say that again?
Well, I know in, like, for example, in a love movie called Breakfast at Tiffany, they had a Mickey Rooney playing an Asian guy, or Peter Sellers something playing an Asian guy.
Right.
I think about like whitewashing, like because they couldn't, or like I think back in like Larry Joseph play a black guy, right? Or yeah, what do you think?
Yeah, totally. Like blackface, and you know, some people call it all kinds of things. But yeah, to your point, that's just straight up racist. You know, like when they, because there was never a shortage of, you know, Black, Asian actors who were capable of, you know, representing our communities. There's never been a shortage of that. And again, you know, I'm only talking really about the US film industry, because there's always, you know, or long been other film industries, you know, of course, in India, we have Bollywood, and like Nigeria is Nollywood, and in China, you have like what's quickly becoming the largest film industry. So, but even in like the 1940s and 50s, there were actors around who could have played these parts. And so the choice to put white people in those roles that comes out of that history in the United States, at least, of minstrel shows and like just, you know, mocking. And there was never an intention there to accurately represent in those castings. It's actually always been to demean and mock. And I think that, but it's good to bring up because, you know, even now when we talk about, if we talk about like, oh, there's not enough stories of our communities falling in love, or just in general, stories that include us, you know, people will still lean on the notion of like, there's not enough, or there's some scarcity of talent, or, you know, it's hard to find folks. And some of that can be true, but that's because a system has been built over 100 years to exclude. And so you do have systemic things like casting processes, and as we mentioned, you know, universities, like who's going to school, who gets to go to school, who gets funding for their projects. And that's why I think it's really important to look at independent cinema. And of course, I'm just gonna like, you know, plug, I work at an independent film festival, but if you look at the film festival circuit, you know, every year there's like thousands actually, but certainly hundreds of amazing films being made by just Asian filmmakers in the United States, you know, and shorts, features, documentaries. And there are stories that are way different than what we're seeing in cinemas, or even now, even as we're home, the ones that show up on Netflix, you know, and sometimes they do make it to Netflix, but I think just encouraging folks to look there, because there's proof there, right? That there's more than enough people to cast in those films if they wanted to.
And the other question is, I have always wondered why there was not that many Asian like romantic lead, because for a man, because they're usually kung fu stars or work in the laundry or work in the restaurant. It wasn't until like 1987 when they had the last input that we had really like a leading man that was Asian. Is there a reason for that? Because there's been a lot of black leading men before that. Thank you.
Well, I think, you know, yeah, I mean, I think that that's a whole nother topic. Particularly, I think if you think about like idealizing, or the ideal of masculinity, and how, what sorts of masculinities are seen as ideal under a white supremacist, you know, patriarchal culture, and the ways in which, you know, certain masculinities serve certain purposes. So you might say like, okay, there's, we might see more Black men in certain roles in cinema in the United States, but we have to look at also like the types of characters that Black men are relegated to playing, and or the messages that those send about what makes an ideal Black man versus the white man, and so forth. And so similarly, I do think that there's a long history of stereotyping of East Asian men as being not, you know, attractive, not being appealing, but also not being dominant. And I think ultimately the ideal man in Hollywood cinema is someone who dominates. And that's because we live in a culture and social system which values domination. And so white men will always have more access to domination than everyone else because they do dominate in real life. And the pursuit of Hollywood romantic leads by other men of color, I think we always have to like complicate it by saying like, okay, do we really want to be Tom Cruise? You know, like, because Tom Cruise is a certain ideal of masculinity, which, you know, as he's historically played, I'm just picking on him, his name came to mind, but like, you know, the characters he's played, that's an ideal of masculinity, which does not serve our communities. It doesn't serve, you know, East Asian men. It doesn't serve, it certainly doesn't serve East Asian women and people of other genders. So in terms of like the representation of men in Hollywood romances, I think the ultimate goal has to we have to break apart that whole storyline and think of new, or I always say like old ways of telling stories. Because again, our communities have other stories and other ideals for men, women, and people of other genders. And so I think that, but yeah, that's a bigger topic, but it's good to bring
The
up.
reason why
Hey, Imran, we got a question from
Sorry.
Captain McBain. The question is, how do you think parents should address racism in classic children's movies?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think and I would put it alongside like, or embedded within that, like racism as it intersects with sexism and class issues and all the things that we mentioned, fat phobia and queer antagonism. I think for me, naming things and pointing them out is super useful. And I have a bunch of nibblings. My siblings all have kids now. And one of the things that, I think sometimes comedy is helpful as well. I always think of, I used to work in an organization called the Representation Project, and we made a film called Misrepresentation. And in that film, Gina Davis makes a remark about how to point out sexism in children's shows. And it just always stands out to me because she says, like when she's watching things with young girls, is just to be like, hey, why is that character wearing that while she's trying to be a superhero? I think about like with Jasmine in Aladdin, it's like, why is Jasmine wearing that and everyone else is wearing other things? And how come, Jasmine doesn't get to make a decision in this scene and those other characters do? I mean, I think it's just like that. And of course, I'm not a parent, so I feel like you probably know better than me, to be honest, like the folks here who are parents. But I think pointing things out, telling the truth and asking questions to me seems the best way. And just like not letting things linger, because a related question, which I'll just go into because I think it's useful, is like, even as adults, when we're around our friends or like people who, may not be noticing these things, I think that humor and just like asking questions is really important, because sometimes you'll be like with your friends watching a movie and something super messed up happens, like a racist scene or, a super, sexist scene, and no one says anything about it. And to me, it's like important to just be like, hey, that was kind of weird, right? I mean, and then just creating space to have a larger conversation. And because ultimately, again, this is a big conversation, and I don't expect adults or kids to be able to, like, in a minute, get everything, but I think it's important to ask this question.
We got a question from Tommy. And then we got some comments from Dean. I'm sorry, skip over there. Agent has no problem winning. Best director, they're supposed to be well organized and smart, but not. And Tommy's question is, will you send me info on how you can support BIPOC-led creative groups like BlackStar, if you have any?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think there's lots of organizations to look for. BlackStar is just one. We do have an annual film festival. It's in August this year. It's online, again, partially, so you can watch, and tickets will be like $5. So it's very accessible, and I encourage you to come check out. And like I said, a lot of the movies that we show, later on get wider audiences, but it's important to support these filmmakers as they're just starting, because it gives them career opportunities and access. There's the Center for Asian American Media, CAM, which does film festivals as well, and great programming if we wanted to look at Asian films. Or there's so many. There's a festival or a group in called Third Horizon, or that is Caribbean films, that's doing great work. Yeah, I can actually follow up with you, Jeff, and I can send you a list if people want. I don't know if you have access to emailing folks, but I'd love to share more of those resources.
Yeah, I think
sure.
we do have a registration list from earlier, so we can send it to those to people who are interested. Let me see.
Awesome. Any other questions?
I have one question, which is, you showed us 2 video clips, right? And so now it makes me think of, wow, the next time I go to a movie, what should I be asking myself? Because usually I go to a movie because I want to see Denzel or I want to see drama or something, you know, or I just want to sit and eat popcorn. I don't really go with a purpose. But now, you know, probably many people on this call in the last year have been to similar, you know, Zooms or webinars or trainings or watching things on the news. So what can we do differently, right? How can we make a difference? So when we go to the movies from now on, how should we be looking at the movie?
Yeah, it's a great question. You know, I think just keep in mind some of the things we chatted about today, like one, the perspective that the film is coming from. You know, you can always look up who made a film, you can Google it and that kind of thing. But I think even when you're in the theater or in front of your screen, is thinking about not just the main storyline, but the storylines behind that. And I think it takes practice to like analyze film. But you know, one of the quotes that always stands out to me is like Renata Adler, who was she was like a film critic, I think in the 70s. She had this like quote about whether or not it's possible to make an anti-war film. And because she said that like what the screen always does when an image appears on the screen, the purpose of like cinema is to glorify. So even if you are, because like when you're in a theater and you look up at the big screen, everything's kind of celebrated. So even when you're watching like a film, which is, you know, trying to say like, don't do this, it's even then it's really hard. She said that film always argues yes. And I think keeping in mind that like when you're watching a piece of media, it's trying to tell you something. It's trying to argue something about what you're seeing. And you know, it's okay to be critical of the things that you love. You know, my friend Anita has an organization called Feminist Frequency, and they have a slogan that says, you know, be critical of the media that you love. And so I think it's actually enjoyable. It doesn't take away from an experience to be like, hey, I like this, but what is it trying to tell me? You know, and being open to having those conversations and not dismissing film as like just entertainment. You know, as we were talking at the top, like, you know, even films like Jaws and Finding Nemo have impacts on our lives. And I think it's fun to talk about that and important because in the end, like, you know, if we're not conscious of the messages that we're receiving from media, then we're just receiving them and we're not playing, we're just accepting that. And I think we have an active role to play to be like, hey, maybe I don't want to accept that idea about myself or about the people around me. And so, yeah, I think it's just, that's all we can do. And it's more than movies, of course, you know, and I think movies are important, but they should inspire us
Right.
towards action. And
No,
so,
absolutely. That's good.
Elizabeth has a comment. She said, I noticed Disney had a disclaimer to some of its old movies that include racist stereotypes. The company said that while it can't change the past, we can acknowledge it, learn from it, and move forward together. Very Disney.
I think, yeah, Song of the South is a great example. I also wanted to add really quickly that, like, to me, I'm always watch Disney movies. That's probably like the only thing I watch. But as I've grown and learned more about like the history of the movies, I like now more than ever notice like the racist past that is embedded within some Disney films. And I think that as of recently, more people have caught on. And I would hope that they would do more and expand, you know, who they represent in the future.
yeah, right on. I mean, I think I don't have much to add to that. I think just, though I will say like one half of the work is pushing Disney and the powerful studios to change. And then again, always the other half is like, in the end, we don't really need them. Like if, you know, like if you gave, you know, some of the filmmakers out there, like the budgets that Disney gets, we could make just as good films and probably much better ones. So anyways, but I'll leave you with that. But thank you for having me here. It was so nice to talk to you all. And yeah, thanks for watching.
Yeah, thank you, Imran. I do have one last question. I know it's time to go, but just one question is I like to ask people, so like up to the point you're at now, what advice would you give to your 18-year-old self, knowing what you know now?
It's a good question. I mean, I think, I guess in the context of what we're talking about
Mhm.
here, it's like, you know, just, there's so many things. That's a tough question. Like, because I feel like 18-year-old me had a lot of issues. But I think it's like, you know, ask questions and don't accept what the dominant culture is telling you about yourself or the people that you love. And, you know, don't be afraid to be yourself and put yourself out there. And watch the movies you like, you know, and find and you know, do the research and look for those stories because you don't, again, you don't have to accept what they give you. So yeah, that's one thing.
Thank you. So everyone, thank you very much for joining us. And if your emails with our registration, we'll be sure to, or I'll be sure to email you out the resources that Imran may have for all of us. Thank you, everyone. Thanks for joining. We'll see you next week for Tomiko Townley, who will be speaking. She's on right now. So Tommy, get ready for those questions, and we'll see you next week.